Mingalaba, and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, February 7, and joining us today is special guest Lorcan Lovett, an independent journalist and Substack writer who has just returned from a visit to Chin State. Good morning, Lorcan.
Hi, Luke.
Before we start our chat on the Chin, I'll quickly go over the news roundup for the week. This is episode 14, the first after the 4-year anniversary of the 2021 military coup. The Myanmar military has again extended the state of emergency it announced on February 1st, 2021, the day of the coup, for a further 6 months, making this the 7th time it's been extended. The military's 2008 constitution, which the military broke in order to carry out its illegal coup, says that an election must be called within 6 months of a state of emergency being lifted. That means we'll likely be hearing from the army next on this in July. Resistance groups continue to maintain skepticism about any military-sponsored election, given the army's ongoing persecution of any opposition to its rule. And the army's demands on the people tightened further this week, with an order that Buddhist monasteries prevent young men summoned for conscription from ordaining as monks or novices. Men who haven't been named for conscription now have term limits on any stay at a monastery, and the military is also demanding monasteries start registering overnight guests, like they do for regular homes and hotels. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of monasteries in Myanmar, and while they are often sanctuaries fled to by displaced people, they are just as often targeted by military soldiers in retaliatory attacks. Electricity, internet, and fuel supplies from Thailand have been cut by decree across 5 border locations, throwing residents' lives into chaos and causing panic buying of fuel and commodities in Myawaddy and Tachilek. The ban comes as Thailand Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra visits Beijing and meets with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Thailand has come under increasing pressure from China to do what it can to combat the cyber scam and casino centres operating close to the Thailand border, such as Shui Go and KK Park. Of these surprise policies, the fuel export ban in particular could have wide implications for fuel prices and availability in Myanmar, even beyond the border areas, if it does become a long-term policy. Resistance groups carried out several ambushes across the country to mark the February 1 coup anniversary, while several larger battles continued. The military appears to be gaining ground in its offensive against Da'an National Liberation Army-held territory in Nangcho Township, and it stymied ongoing attacks in Damu Township of Sagaing. But elsewhere, the military suffered a string of defeats. An allied force of several resistance groups, including the Burma People's Liberation Army, the Force for Federal Democracy, and the Karen National Liberation Army, or the KNLA, publicised their capture of a key hilltop base in Mun State over the weekend. The operation took over a month in total, and the capture of the Me Ba Li tactical hill base positions the KNLA and its allies to control the road east from Bilin into KNLA Brigade 5 territory and Babun or Mutro, putting further pressure on the few remaining military bases in that area. 27 soldiers were captured and 2 resistance fighters were killed in the battle for the base. People's Defence Forces and the military have engaged in several skirmishes in Magwe's Sepiu, Saling and Puingpiu townships just this last week, displacing more than 6,000 people, according to locals. Close to 169 homes have been reported torched by soldiers, and 1 police station was captured and burned down by the resistance forces, who took 14 soldiers prisoner. These townships are all just 1 township east of the Rakhine Yoma or mountain range, which is now under control of the Arakan Army, or AA, and they're home to at least 3 of the more than 15 defence industry factories producing arms and ordnance in Magwe region. Military outposts in Ngapir Township, closely abutting those mountains, were also attacked by the AA last week, with more than 60 soldiers reported killed, jeopardizing the military's ongoing scramble to reinforce this road into Mugwe from Rakhine State and protect its factories from potential combined AA, Chin Brotherhood and local defence force attacks. Just south of there, the AA also further penetrated into forested regions of the Baun Township in Irrawaddy region, amid reports that military families and elites are increasingly evacuating Bathane for Yangon. Then the Minjan People's Defence Force attacked a Myanmar military outpost in Dalotnyo, about 2 kilometres from the Irrawaddy River, southwest of Mandalay, on February 1. They were repulsed by airstrikes, with reports of at least 60 bombs being dropped on the area. In total, at least 18 people were killed by military airstrikes across Sagaing and Mugwe this week, including a direct hit on a Gali Township IDP camp. The dead included a monk, 5 children, and a pregnant woman. Masses of bombs were also dropped on Bamor in Kachin State this week as the Kachin Independence Army continued to conquer military positions there. The latest being the seizures of the No. 2 Electrical and Mechanical Engineering Corps and the Artillery 366 base on February 2. Now to Chin State, where members of the Chin Brotherhood continue to battle for control of Falam. The Institute of Chin Affairs released a coup anniversary report on February 1, claiming that since the 2021 coup, 963 Chin people have been killed, and 241 airstrikes have dropped more than 1,600 bombs, destroying more than 1,300 structures and buildings in Chin State. Military arson has also caused the destruction of 3,500 homes. In this environment, however, Chin resistance groups and their allies have managed to take control of significant territory, and now the Myanmar military has lost half of the townships in the state outright, including all of the southern townships bordering AA-held Rakhine State. But the Chin resistance groups are not all of the same mind, as discussed with R. Lacker in episode 6 of this podcast. A major cleavage exists between the Chinlin Council and the Chin Brotherhood, both umbrella groups of several smaller resistance armies, and there continues to be sporadic fighting between their members. Our guest today, Lorcan Lovett, recently travelled to Chin State and spent time with the Chin National Defence Force, a Chin Brotherhood alliance member. It's our privilege to have Lorcan on so soon after his visit. So, Lorcan, congratulations on your successful and safe reporting trip. Where did you go exactly, and what were your priorities?
Sure. So thanks a lot for having me on today. I went to Falam Township, which borders India in Chin State. To get to Falam is not easy. To get to Chin State is not easy. I cannot go into too much details about that. However, a big difference between going to somewhere like Chin State and going to somewhere in eastern Myanmar is that it takes days, if not weeks, longer to get there. And that kind of process of assimilation is much slower. Whereas if you report from eastern Myanmar, 1 minute you could be standing in a 7-Eleven, and then within a couple of hours, you're just in this big battleground with militia roaming around. So it can be quite surreal how quickly that changes. But Chin State, it takes a while to get there. It's rugged terrain, and many of the locals there spend their childhoods hunting game. And that traditional hunting culture has proved useful for the fight against the military. Now, over the years and over these reporting trips in Myanmar, every time I go, there's less and less of a military presence other than from the skies. Sometimes you can drive for hours and hours on a major highway, and the only reminder of the Myanmar military you will get is one of their bases, which has been overrun and is now occupied by the resistance. So the idea that the Myanmar military is capable of launching a ground offensive in Chin State seems very, very remote right now. And I personally didn't feel like that was a prospect for the military at all. there. I was with a team of Valeria Mongeli, who's a photographer, and Salai Johnny, who is supporting us. And we decided to go to Falam town, or as close as possible as we could get, because right now there's a very crucial battle taking place for Falam. The Myanmar military has only one more garrison in the town, and I was told about 120 soldiers were trapped inside, surrounded by about 500 to 600 resistance fighters. If those fighters are successful, they will control the whole of Falam, and then they will be able to proceed to the next Chin town and ultimately down into Sagaing and to Anya region and the central drylands. The resistance groups who are participating in that operation, led by a group called the CNO, the Chin National Organization, as far as I was aware and what I was told, have no support from ethnic armed organizations in this fight. So if they are successful, that will be a turning point in the Chin Revolution and perhaps in Myanmar as a whole. It will show that these post-coup forces are able to take and hold a major town by themselves. So that's a significant development in this revolution.
Falam was relatively peaceful after the coup, but last year residents started leaving in anticipation of this conflict. How long has the battle for Falam been going on for now?
It started in earnest in November, and the operation to take Falam is codenamed Mission Jerusalem, which is a nod to how devoutly Christian that area is, as many of your listeners will know. So it began in November, but before that, the resistance had set up a network of clinics near the front line and then in other areas. So that kind of planning has been in place for 4, 5, 6 months before November. But Mission Jerusalem began in November, and that's when they entered the town. Immediately, there were some Myanmar military soldiers and police force who surrendered, but that last remaining garrison held out. And since then, it's become a siege on the garrison to try to squeeze those junta soldiers who remain and either force them to surrender or to defeat them in battle, which has proven extremely difficult because although they are fewer in number, the junta soldiers have air support, which is a story that's very familiar across Myanmar. And anytime the resistance approaches the base, they are heavily punished by fighter jets and by transport planes, and the base is equipped with artillery, machine guns, etc.
And what do the resistance forces have in their favour? What are their weapons?
The CNO and their allies there, and we can get into their allies a little bit because that's also very interesting. They have about at least 15 different resistance groups from that part of Myanmar, not just Chin State, but the central drylands participate in Burma forces as well as Chin forces. And they have conventional firearms, semi-automatic rifles, RPGs, grenade launchers, machine guns, I was told as well. Although I didn't see any, I was told that right on the front they have at least one machine gun, which is very useful if a junta helicopter tries to land near the base. They have sniper rifles, and they have mortar as well. Oh, and they have drones, but they are not using the drones because the Myanmar military base has jammers, and they are not switching off the drone jammers because they know that if they decide to switch those jammers off and launch their own drones, they'll just get swarmed by resistance drones as well. So they don't consider that worth it. So they keep the jammers on. Quite unusually for a front line in Myanmar now, there are no drones at all there. So the main factor in this is that the Myanmar military has fighter jets and transport planes from which they roll out barrel bombs. They're not very accurate, but they can be deadly. Many resistance leaders in that area told me very confidently that they believe they could take that base within a day if it wasn't for the jets.
You also mentioned helicopters landing near the base. So is the base being reinforced, or is it totally cut off?
So what the Myanmar military tries to do is drop in the soldiers via helicopter. But these airborne reinforcements cannot get near the base. As I mentioned, the resistance controls most of Falam town and has serious weaponry targeted at the base. So when a helicopter tries to land there, they send like a barrage of bullets towards the helicopter. Instead, the helicopters drop soldiers on the outskirts of the town, and then the soldiers have to fight their way in or sneak their way into the base. So they've tried that several times, and so far they've been unsuccessful in reinforcing their base. One thing I should add is that these airborne reinforcements are usually conscripts. It's one of their first, if not their first, combat experience, and they're not really sure what they're doing. They surrender easily. They're understandably very afraid. Some of them run down into the valleys and just try to run back to the central drylands, like tens of kilometers or more away. So it's been a bit of a disaster for the Myanmar military. But the fact is, they're still there holding out in Falam as well.
Okay, they're holding out. But will they fall? I know. I mean, you were just there, but what's your sense of the time frame? Is the military going to be removed from Falam?
It's hard to predict the future, obviously, but I think that the resistance will be able to take Falam. Eventually, I think it will fall because of the situation that the Myanmar military soldiers are in. Their water has been cut, their electricity has been cut. The commanders in the base, I was told, have removed all of the phones from the soldiers still inside. They're under intense pressure. Both sides have teams of snipers, and anytime the junta soldiers in the base become complacent or are in the wrong place at the wrong time, they are likely to get shot by a sniper. That kind of psychological pressure, I can't imagine they're able to resist for much longer. However, as I said, the Myanmar military has the jets. The resistance is also under its own pressures. So they have hundreds of fighters from lots of different groups in the central drylands and Chin State. And then that comes with its own command issues. For instance, coordinating multiple groups brings complex dynamics. Different fighters working together who are unfamiliar with each other risks tensions and mistrust and misunderstandings in the heat of battle. And local Chin commanders worry about the outside fighters' potential disregard for local properties. If the fighter isn't local, they're more likely to, destroy cars or homes.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the military's, general absence on the ground in the area. So what's freedom of movement like? You, as an embedded foreign reporter, could you report how you wanted, or were you kept on a tight leash? What sort of restrictions did you face?
On this trip, I found we were allowed quite a lot of freedom, although we weren't allowed right inside the Falan town. And that was for their operational reasons and probably for our own safety as well, because there were airstrikes every day there. We were also hearing airstrikes regularly, and some of our interviews took place inside dirt shelters because of airstrikes, or some of our interviews were interrupted by jet fighters, and then we had to run into the bunkers. The main group in Falam is the Chin National Organization and their armed wing, the Chin National Defense Force, and they allowed us quite a lot of freedoms to talk to whoever we wanted. On this occasion, we were staying in civilian homes and not in fighter camps, and so we were allowed to arrange our own interviews and to request the people who we wanted to speak with. So in that sense, it was quite free.
Thank you, Lorcan. Now, can I briefly be excused to ask our listeners something directly? Did you know Frontier Myanmar has another podcast? It's called Do Atan, which means Our Voice, and it's focused on human rights stories with episodes often in both Burmese and English languages. The latest episode dropped just yesterday and is all about coping with 4 years of the coup, hearing from local voices and a doctor from the Mind Healers group. Just search Do Atan, DOHATHAN, in your favourite podcast app to check it out. And we are back. So, Lorcan, you had plenty of freedom to talk to who you wanted. Who can we look forward to meeting and reading about in your articles? Did you make any new friends in Falam?
Yes, always making friends on these trips. And in this case, 3 individuals really spring to mind. The first is a 17-year-old sniper who was trained by an American international volunteer in Chin State. I'm actually working on a feature about this sniper at the moment, but for me, she really epitomized not only the bravery of the younger generation and their willingness to confront the military in battle at a potential cost to their own lives, but also the stolen education, the pandemic and the coup, and this 17-year-old who turns 18 on Chin National Day, February the 20th. She's missed out on those years of schooling, and there's so many others like her. But I mean, she was a really unique character because not only is she basically an elite sniper before she even turns 18, she's also the only woman on the front line in that battle. And I'm going to get into that a bit more when I write about her soon. Another friend who I made out there was Olivia, who is the defense secretary of the CNO. And she is paving the way for women in combat roles in Chin State. She's actually a karate champion. She competed for Myanmar internationally in karate and is now leading from the ground in Chin State. Very inspirational and interesting person. And then another unique character out there is an American international volunteer, Azad. I first wrote about Azad when I was writing articles about foreign fighters in Myanmar. And on this trip, I had an opportunity to meet him and spend some time with him. He's helping to start a group called, I think it's called the Anti-Fascist International Front, which will bring in more international volunteers, not necessarily to one place, but just to Myanmar in general. He has helped to train snipers and other resistance soldiers in that area. So it was very interesting to meet him as well and to understand his motives better, and also to see the reaction of local resistance fighters to having somebody from the US there, because for them it's unbelievable, but it's also very encouraging for them to see international volunteers are taking an interest and contributing to their struggle. It makes them feel less isolated.
And what were the civilian areas or the resistance bases? You know, these mixed resistance groups, the communities. What were the communities like? And what sort of dynamics were at play away from the conflict zone?
So as we drive towards Falam, we start to see villages which have been hit by airstrikes, churches which have been destroyed in air raids, and abandoned homes. We start to notice displaced people sleeping under bridges or on the side of the road, using kind of tarpaulin as shelter. And this is Chin State in the winter, so it does get very cold there, and they have babies with them, children with them, and are struggling for food, especially protein as well. As always, the civilians are really bearing the brunt of it. And then I'm sitting next to a commander who's driving us towards Falam town, and we see 2 truckloads of prisoners of war who are terrified come past us. So the commander stops, and the fighters in the back of our truck jump out, and they start questioning the POWs in these trucks. And the POWs just shout out, "Oh, we're conscripts, we're conscripted forces." And a Chin resistance fighter says, "Well, you were conscripted 5 months ago. What were you doing before then? We've been fighting the revolution." And then another says, "You're lucky to be captured here and not in the." He's saying you're lucky to be captured here and not in Sagaing. What he's implying is that like they'd be tortured or killed in Sagaing by the militias there. And he said that as well. He said none of you would be alive there. And then I thought, quite interestingly, this exchange was that a Burma resistance fighter who had come from the central drylands asked one of the POWs, who are also Burma, who was taunting them when they were clashing, because the Myanmar military soldiers, these POWs, apparently some of them were telling the Burma resistance fighters to come first and charge at them first so that they could kill the Burma first. The implication was that the Burma resistance were race traitors to the Burma majority army. So the prisoners were really pleading, "It wasn't us, it wasn't us." So we have that interaction, and then we get down into Falam town on the outskirts. And there we meet about a dozen civilians who have decided to remain in the town and support the resistance. Now, this is something that's so crucial for the revolution in Myanmar, is the villagers who decide to stay in these places and who often cook for the resistance or support them in other ways. So we were staying with those civilians. Some of them don't necessarily stay just because of the resistance. They might have other obligations. They might want to protect their own homes. But inevitably, they get sucked into the conflict dynamics there. So we met this wonderful lady whose name I won't mention just out of security reasons now. But she was such a strong example of these civilians who stay behind and become a really integral part of these local operations by sheltering the resistance fighters. She took on a kind of motherly role, but she was also telling off a lot of these fighters as well if they were misbehaving. Remember, these guys are often 18, 19 years old, and if they get hold of some chin wine, they can cause a bit of chaos. So she was stepping in as the kind of mother there as well. And I think for the fighters, she was such a kind of a welcoming presence there, something familiar in that, right? It wasn't just them trying to take the space. It was actually like people who they could associate with their own family members who had stayed behind as well. But everybody there is living under the constant threat of airstrikes. So it's incredibly dangerous for these civilians too.
Did you observe any effects of the split between the Chin Brotherhood and the Chinland Council?
So the Chin resistance has divided into 2 main coalitions. The Chinland Council, which is backed by the CNF, which is the Chin National Front, the established ethnic armed group in that area that was formed in the late 80s. And then this new post-coup coalition, the Chin Brotherhood. So this split really became apparent in late 2023 after what had previously been a united front against the military. So the Chin Brotherhood operates under what remains of something called the Interim Chin National Consultative Council, ICNCC, which the CNF was previously part of. I won't go too much into all of the acronyms here, but what we can say is that the CNF Chinland Council groups are strong in central and northern Chin State, while the Chin Brotherhood is strongest in the south. And recently, the Chin Brotherhood has had some big military successes, especially taking Mindat. Now, in Falam, as I said, they have no help from ethnic armed groups. which is what they told me. But in Mindat, the Arakan army was helping them, and they were able to take that town quite clinically and quickly. So now the Chin Brotherhood has become much stronger, and it's having more military success than the Chinland Council. Everybody I spoke to who is in a leadership position wanted to talk about the split. And I spoke to both sides on this trip, and they weren't holding back. There was animosity there, and there was real tension, and sometimes it was difficult to see how this will be resolved. But importantly, I sensed there was also an appetite to resolve the issue. And Chin Brotherhood, of which CNO is a member, believes the best strategy for leverage in future talks with their Chin opposition is to take as many towns as possible now and to strengthen their position in those future talks. So I based that on what they told me. We can briefly get into the nitty-gritty about why they're fighting, but you could also just boil it down to power and who wants to control Chin State in the future. As the military presence is weakening, not only in Chin State, but across the border areas, there are multiple factions who are jockeying for control of those areas so that they can be the future representatives of those places. But getting it more into the details, the Chin Brotherhood, the post-coup coalition, believe that no single organization can represent all of Chin State without approval from all 9 townships. And they want to focus on fighting the military first before building political institutions. They worry that the CNF, the established ethnic armed group, will want to dominate Chin State after this and during this as well. So in Chin State, Chin, we can say, is an umbrella ethnicity, but then you have lots of different sub-ethnicities underneath the Chin, and some of them are based on dialect groups. And the Chin Brotherhood are concerned that if each dialect group gets its own township, it would fragment the region even further. And these small administrative units could cause future conflict. So they want to approach Chin State from a township-based perspective, whereas the Chinland Council and the CNF are more in favor of supporting the dialect-based administrations. So that's become a real cause of tension between the two sides. But I thought it was interesting that the argument that the Chin Brotherhood and CNO were putting forward was that they believe that the CNF doesn't have the right to represent the whole of Chin State, and that each township should be represented individually. But by doing that, they're stopping the dialect groups from having their own representation. So there's not an easy answer to that. And there is a lot of animosity and tension. What I found particularly worrying was that the tensions between these two sides express themselves among civilians now as well. I was told even in the refugee camps, you have Chin Brotherhood School, or a CNF school. They might not be called that, but schools that are associated with either side, even health clinics that are associated with either side. Those tensions have become pervasive within the civilian population and are starting to create that atmosphere where even children in refugee camps either associate with the Chin Brotherhood or the CNF. And that's a real problem for the future of Chin State.
Yeah, that's quite sad and interesting. Thank you for that. To finish up, Lorcan, you have now visited several different parts of Myanmar that are all outside the control of the military since the coup. And this week marks 4 years. So how has witnessing the battle for Falam, most recently, informed your thinking about the wider revolution? Where to from here?
This trip was evidence for me personally that the military is becoming weaker and weaker. The first ever trip after the coup into Myanmar involved crawling on our hands and knees through the jungle in the night on the extreme peripheries of Myanmar just to visit some displaced people and stop in there because the military controlled so much. Every visit I take into Myanmar, the military presence becomes weaker and weaker, and I have more room to move around and to meet more people. And Chin State was definitely added to that trajectory for me. The fighters there are so confident that they will expel the military from Chin State that they're not even thinking about that issue too much. They're thinking way ahead about going to areas in Sagaing where the military launches their attacks, and to Magway region, and focusing on targets in those areas rather than in Chin State. For them, although there's still a lot of fighting to go in Chin State, especially in Hakka and some of the bigger towns, many of them think this is almost a done deal. We need to look ahead. And because they're all post-coup forces, unlike the long-standing ethnic armed groups who are often focused on territorial enclaves, I asked them, will you really go to Yangon? Will you really go to Mandalay or Naypyidaw? And they said, yes, we have we have a few thousand fighters in this one group, the CNO, and we have more fighters in the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood will go to those areas. And we will keep fighting until the end of the military. So nothing that I've seen on each trip has really denied that claim. It seems that they're making more ground. But I don't want to make this out to be a definite done deal that the resistance are going to win and that the military, for them, it's over. Because as we know, the military are very resilient in their own way, and they still control the major cities and the airports. They're still backed by Russia and China and have access to sophisticated, serious weaponry. And the resistance itself has so many internal splits and groups with their own visions and agendas for what they want Myanmar to be, that we've got a long, long way to go before we see some kind of conclusion.
Thank you, Lorcan, for all of that. It's been wonderful to have you on the show this week. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having me on, Nick.
And for people who want to read more, Lorcan's first dispatch from Chin State was published in The Times this week, and there's a link to it in the show notes, as well as links to other relevant articles, and to Lorcan's Substack called On Myanmar. If you subscribe to that Substack, you won't miss any of Lorcan's upcoming articles in the pipeline, and you'll get access to a lot of bonus content from the author himself. And since you're now in the mood for subscribing, remember that you can also subscribe to Frontier Myanmar and support us too with a simple click at www.frontiermyanmar.net/membership. If you're already a member, thank you so much. And as this podcast was being produced, the recently appointed Association of Southeast Asian Nations Special Envoy on Myanmar, Othman Hashim, was scheduled to be in Naypyidaw for talks with military coup leader Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and others. We'll be sure to cover that visit and more in our next episode as the details develop. So until then, farewell, and as usual, take care.